Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elena Olson, a program associate for the entrepreneurial engineering team at the Kern Family Foundation. Today, Ella Ingram and Bill Kline of Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology have prepared a great presentation for you about creating value, the third C of the Keen 3 Cs, the first two being curiosity and connections. For a little bit about our presenters, Ella is the Associate Dean for Professional Development and an Associate Professor of Biology. She's also a facilitator of the project Making Academic Change Happen, an initiative focused on helping faculty and administrators become successful change agents. Bill is the Associate Dean of Innovation as well as a Professor of Engineering Management. Prior to joining Rose-Hulman, his industry experience included roles as a co-founder and Chief Operating Officer at Medtronics and a development manager at Kennametal. A couple quick housekeeping items, and then I'll turn it over to Ella and Bill. During the webinar, you can use your control panel's question entry box to type a question to our presenters. We'll have a question and answer session following the presentation, but feel free to type your questions as they come up. I'll be reading the questions to Ella and Bill to respond to them. Also, we'll be sharing these slides as well as a recording of the webinar after the presentation to all participants. Okay, Ella and Bill, I'm ready for you. Thank you very much for leading today's session.
Great, thanks Elena for your help in getting this session set up and doing all the coordination. I want to welcome all our participants. Elena told me that we're expecting quite a number of people to participate from schools all around the country. So I'm really glad to have the opportunity to share with you some ideas that Bill and I have worked on relating to promoting value creation mindset. We started this work by doing a workshop for Rose-Hulman faculty, and that was picked up and shared with some other institutions. Then I wrote a blog post for the Keen network, and then Elena and I discussed doing a webinar, and I managed to convince Bill to do this with me. So this is Bill's premier performance or initial performance in the webinar way of communicating. So today, as participants, we hope that you take away two specific outcomes. The first is that we want to share a revenue-neutral model or conception of value. And this is something that we think has great application in engineering design. And then finally, would like all of our participants to be able to demonstrate a two-step strategy for evaluating value and be able to do that for their students. And so really our focus here is going to be how to get this material in front of your students, and that's going to be something that Bill talks about at the end of the session. So I'm going to start by getting us thinking about where we're going with this webinar. So we contend that value creation mindset centers on considering stakeholders, product features, design processes, and the selection strategies that stakeholders use. And all of this comes down for us to 4 key points. And these key points will be what we use to frame this webinar. So we'll discuss each of these key points in order and then bring it all together at the end. So our first key point, I'm going to give them all right now, and then we'll go one by one. So our first key point is that value represents a perception based on multiple dimensions, which is expressed in the choices that stakeholders make. So perception is important and choice is important, and we'll see that in just a second. Key point number 2 is that the alignment of stakeholder interests and features is what creates value in products and services. So alignment is the key point in this particular item. Key point number 3 is that when a product or system is chosen, stakeholders value it above competing options. So the chosen aspect is what demonstrates that value has been identified. And finally, key point number 4 is that designing for value is challenging represented by the high rate of product failure in the marketplace. And this is no surprise to anyone involved in the design process. Design is hard to learn, even harder to teach. It's the hallmark activity of engineering, yet engineers, while mandated to create value, often don't do that. We know that up to 40% of new products fail in the marketplace. So our final key point is about designing for value and how challenging it is. So this work overall is part of a larger comprehensive design process and a system perspective, and that area is Bill's expertise, and he'll be talking about that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to start by addressing key point number 1. Value represents a perception based on multiple dimensions expressed in choices. And we already know this to be true in a variety of ways. I'll give you just a very quick example. Here's a selection of vehicles. Some people would contend that value is a preference judgment. And looking at these vehicles, you probably immediately were attracted to one of the options, and that's your preference. Other people, other scholars would contend that value is situational, seasonal, or temporal. Now you can certainly appreciate this point because our nice red sports car in the bottom row is going to handle a little bit differently than the minivan right next to it during winter season. And so that would be seasonal, for example. Situational might be family status, which changes over time. Temporal might be age of the stakeholder or age of the consumer, which changes over time. We also know that value is related to selection or choice. The American public has made choices about which of these vehicles they find to have the most value in aggregate. That's based on which vehicles are purchased the most. And finally, scholars would contend that value contains many different elements and some of the things that we don't necessarily see. For example, the environmental cost of production or use of different products or services, the social or cultural implications of products or services, and then finally, we would also be able to include the financial aspects. And as you and I both know, these vehicles have different price tags associated with them. So we would say that the value space is the intersection of stakeholders and features. And this is going to be captured very much so in perception. So as you can see, the perception of these particular vehicles will be quite different. And therein lies a possible conception of value. So having thought about value as a perception based on multiple possible dimensions that would be ultimately expressed in choice, we're going to provide a couple of key examples in this webinar. And our point is not so much to focus on the allocation of example to item, for example, the red sports car being valued for speed, but it's to illustrate the model. So we encourage you to think outside the box if you have an immediate reaction to, for instance, the minivan being for hauling, not for economy. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bill, who's going to get us started on key point number 2.
Thank you, Ella. So that brings us to our key point number 2, which is alignment of stakeholder interests and features create value in products and services. Ella's done a nice job of introducing us to the concepts that products and systems have multiple stakeholders that have an interest in its design and use, and that features are really the aspects of products and services that stakeholders value. So as we focus on the concepts of stakeholders and features, we're going to use this matrix or this view to collect and capture the important information. Across the top, we're going to capture our important stakeholders. We're going to include a priority of low, medium, or high as to how they factor into the situation. Across the left, we're going to capture features and attributes. These are going to be the characteristics of the system that stakeholders value. And this view or this framework will be a nice way to capture all the information that we'll be talking about in the next example. So for an example, let's consider a system to make and provide coffee. So at this point, we're not considering any one particular system, but the concept in general. So we have makes coffee as the main functional activity of our system. We have inputs coming in the left and outputs going out the right. Our inputs might include water, coffee grounds, energy, some user inputs, and out the left we get coffee, some waste coffee grounds, and waste energy. So let's consider who some of our stakeholders might be. So a stakeholder is any individual, other system, or even an organization with an interest in the development, use, or outcome of the system. And stakeholders don't necessarily have to interact directly with the system. Common stakeholders, our mind immediately goes to who's the customer, but I think we've found that the concept of a customer is a little bit vague. So let's divide that one into the consumer and the buyer. So the user of the system versus the buyer of the system are not necessarily the same person or the same entity. And we can continue on thinking about other stakeholders who may have an interest in the system, and that might include the manufacturer, even the maintainer, the transport service, the waste manager. So there's a long list of stakeholders who may have an interest in this system. Thinking about features and moving over to features, a feature is a characteristic of a system that is valued or desired by the stakeholders. They're ultimately the reason why we choose one offering or product over another. And they commonly express form, fit, function, and are some of the words like the ables and the ilities. We're going to further define feature attributes to provide a little bit more quantitative and measurable metric around each feature. A feature can have multiple attributes that are necessary to describe it. So in this case, a common feature, maybe the first one we think about for a system that makes coffee, would be taste. That would be a very important characteristic of the coffee being produced. And we can think of some other features here. And we've got the coffee temperature. Don't want it too cold. We want variety. Maybe we want different flavors. The delivery time, the time to make the coffee, the cleaning time. So all of these features would be the important characteristics that stakeholders might use in valuing the system. Talking about attributes, in order to come up with attributes, we need to think about metrics that are quantifiable and measurable. Taste is a little bit tricky. We might have to use a survey to try to assess some sort of measure of taste. The others are maybe a little easier here. We've got, we can measure temperature, degrees Fahrenheit, number of flavors, and some time and some cost for some of the other ones. So we'll go back to our table or our view, which we put up earlier. We're going to take the stakeholders we've just identified, put them across the top row. We've identified the consumer and the buyer as high priority. In this example of a system to make coffee, we'll take the features and attributes we just identified and put them in the columns on the left. The next thing we want to do is try to assess how our stakeholders are going to react to or value these features. And we're going to use a number of different categories here. E is expected, which means the consumer or the stakeholder is going to expect that feature to be present in the system. A D is for a delighter, which means I would be extra pleased or delighted to find that feature in the system. A blank is no option, which means the stakeholder doesn't really care about it. A 1 means a feature that the presence and the amount of it is in direct proportion to the value that the stakeholder places upon it. Example might be in a car like fuel economy or horsepower. I value more horsepower, and that would be a characteristic I would look at as a single item. And then the down arrow would be features that the particular stakeholder doesn't like or doesn't want. So we've gone through our example here and tried to indicate some thoughts on how our different stakeholders might value these different features. For the consumer, taste and variety are the important ones. Those are the delighters. We find that the buyer doesn't care about maybe taste and temperature. They're more interested in how affordable it is in terms of how much it maybe costs to buy the system. The consumer is more interested in the affordability in terms of the cost per serving. So this brings us to a nice framework here for assessing value. We've identified important stakeholders. We've captured all of those. We have captured all of our important features and attributes, and we've tried to capture the thoughts and feelings of our consumers and how they're going to value and perceive all of these different features. So at this point, let me turn it back over to Ella.
Great. So Bill walked you through how we're using this view to characterize alignment of stakeholder interests and features to create value in products and services. That's our key point number 2. And my job is just to throw in a couple of intriguing questions at this point. So first, I'm going to illustrate that we can scale this particular view to as many different stakeholders as we need. So a question that we would encourage students to ask if they were using this, or anyone doing design, is, are all the important stakeholders captured? And is the priority level of each stakeholder actually correct? So here we threw in 2 additional stakeholders. We assigned them both to relatively low priority, kind of consistent with the American way up until these days, and we would be able to scale out many additional stakeholders in the coffee system. Once we've identified the additional stakeholders, of course, we're going to want to reconsider our features and attributes and determine if all of the features that we've identified are actually valued by at least one stakeholder. If a feature doesn't have value to a stakeholder, it's something that's really just confusing the issue. And then, are there any features that are either undervalued or overvalued that might help us in the alignment process? So here we've said that we have identified that the scaling of the feature waste measured by the attribute pounds per unit is proportional for waste managers. And in fact, waste production is actually a detractor for the environment. So given that, then we would add in other questions relating to creating this alignment. So where is it that finances actually enter into this model? That's one particular question. We have affordability captured in 2 different ways with 2 different attributes. But we could also characterize, for instance, waste as a financial measure. We could capture cleaning time as a financial measure if we wanted. However, we're also going to encourage you to capture non-financial aspects of features. And this would be consistent with ABET criteria. Engineers should have the ability to design, I'm quoting now, systems, components, processes to meet desired needs within realistic constraints such as economic, environmental, social, political, ethical, health and safety, manufacturability, and sustainability. Those are all non-financial aspects that can be incorporated into this particular model. This model will feed into the design process. we'll be able to consider, are we getting close to causing feature fatigue? Are there too many things that are meant to be expected parts of the product or service, or delighters in this product or service? We also know that consumers give more weight to capability and less weight to usability before they use something versus after they use something. They choose overly complex products that tend to result in feature fatigue. So all of these pieces can fit into the design process. And I'm going to throw it back to Bill, who's going to talk about taking this design and making a bridge to our third key point. Bill? Sorry about that.
No problem. So this work we've just done is part of a larger approach to some systems concepts and engineering design. The first view gives us a very clear idea of what features are important in the design of a product or system. So the features that we have just taken in a design class would then be used as inputs to a number of middle steps here to create the design of a product or system. And out the other side of that would be a number of different possible design choices or solutions that we or the students could then evaluate relative to these features, and that will be coming up a little bit later. All right, so our third key point is when a product or system is chosen, stakeholders value it above other and competing options. So going back to our example of vehicles, our auto engineers and designers know that there are different groups of people that value different features. All these vehicles have a common base of features, but some additional ones make them unique for particular drivers and users. In an educational setting, we know that more features do not necessarily equal success. We've all used that product or system that's just way too complicated. I want to do one basic simple thing, but all of the other aspects just get in the way and make it too hard to do. So back to the previous discussion of, do all the features have a stakeholder that values it? And the other key point here is we look at features and we align them with our priorities, and that's how we ultimately make choices. So of these 6 vehicles here, I mean, the clear choice for me, it would be to select the 1992 Honda Accord station wagon. I don't know how you could possibly select any of the other options out of those 6. So let's take this concept and look at an example around the case of making coffee. So we're going to consider 3 different examples of systems to make coffee. D1 is the traditional home brew drip coffee maker. D2 is the Keurig coffee maker system that's been very popular lately. And D3 is buying coffee from Starbucks. Each one of these can be viewed as a system to provide coffee. Various inputs are applied, and as an output, we get hot coffee. So across the top of this view or matrix, we have a scale of how well a particular one of these designs is going to implement the feature. It's not quantitative. It's good, very good, not as good, and very not as good on the other side. So that's the scale across the top. The items on the left are the features that we identified are important to our stakeholders. We're going to take one of the 3 options as our baseline or our benchmark. So in this case, we're going to take D1 as the traditional home brewed coffee maker as the benchmark. And now we're going to take each of the other options, D2 and D3, and compare it to D1 on a feature by feature basis. So here we're showing that D2, the Keurig, maybe takes or is better in terms of the time to deliver the coffee, and it's not quite as good. It's more expensive in terms of affordability and the dollars per serving. So we're going to take D2 and D3, evaluate and compare them to D1 on a feature-by-feature basis, and we get a complete table that we have filled in that shows how D2 and D3, the Keurig coffee maker and the Starbucks option, both compare to the traditional home-brewed coffee maker. And some interesting things start to show up here. So if we look at the Starbucks option and highlight where it seems to fall, it's a case of extremes. There are some features that it performs very well on. We're giving Starbucks a high rating on taste. We're giving Starbucks a high rating on variety, and that's just how it compares to the other two options. But in terms of the time for delivery, if you have to go to Starbucks, it maybe doesn't rate quite as well. So this is a very nice view for evaluating different choices or evaluating different options relative to a standard or relative to a benchmark. And if you think about it, in most situations that we're faced with, there is some standard or there is some benchmark. And we're evaluating some new option relative to the choice or solution that we have already made. At this point, I think I turn it back over to Ellen.
Okay, so Bill walked you through our second view, and with the second view, the key point that we're attempting to make is that we can scale these choices that consumers, or I'm sorry, stakeholders might be making, and use that to see how the competing options stack up. So while we're thinking about this view, let's ask a couple of questions. So is there a dominant option that's obvious? Is there one particular model of the coffee system that provides superior results on all of the features and attributes that we formerly identified? If that dominant option exists, new entries into the marketplace are going to really struggle with what it means to be competing against that dominant option. Another thing that we can think about is who are the people or who are the stakeholders that would pick our different designs. So for example, what is the set of characteristics that surrounds the stakeholders who would choose D1 as our standard drip coffee system? The drip coffee system seems to work just fine in most characteristics. Might not be culturally interesting if you're a 19-year-old, might be very satisfying if you're 67. These different types of constraints can help us build personas that would provide guidance in the selection process. So for example, the persona of a struggling artist who is very much interested in being known as a cultural icon is probably going to be a little bit more interested in Starbucks coffee than they are going to be in the drip coffee. However, we might have a price and relatively time-conscious consumer who is far more interested in the drip coffee. Keurig coffee is somewhere in the middle of this particular system. Another way that we can use this particular view is to identify why it is that stakeholders have dissatisfaction with products or services. So using again the Keurig example, we might be very interested in understanding, is there a benefit to impacting the durability of, say, the Keurig pods that you would buy, like their particular shelf life? Would that have some impact on the satisfaction of consumers? If we could make that particular product marginally less expensive, how is that going to impact the assessment that consumers or stakeholders would have of that particular product? Would we be able to move Keurig D2 into the neutral category, make it equivalent to drip coffee, or would we be able to add it up into the positive category such that it would be considered better than drip coffee? If that was true, might have an opportunity to really make an impact in the marketplace. Another question that we can use this view to ask is, what are some of the fundamental assumptions that we're making in this particular model? Have we accounted for the right features and scaled them to the right attributes? Is taste scaled or determined by survey results really the right feature? Or is taste somehow an indicator of something else like caffeine concentration? Does high temperature mean something informative, or is it simply getting up to the right temperature and then anything above that is irrelevant? These are all the types of questions we can use to test the fundamental assumptions that we're generating with the way that we've created our views. So this final view is emphasizing the third key point. When a product or system is chosen, stakeholders value it above competing options, above other options. At this point, I'm going to throw it back to Bill, and Bill's going to walk you through some examples of how we have used this material in classrooms.
So that brings us to our fourth key point, which is when we design for value, it's challenging, and this is represented by the high rate of product failure in the marketplace. In doing some research for this work, we found some literature that suggested that some 40% of products and services aren't successful in the marketplace once they get there. And there's some uncertainty around how to define success. But in any case, that 40% number is fairly high. And you find some articles that suggest that the failure rate is even higher. So that suggested to us that we're doing some things wrong in terms of how we teach design, how practitioners practice design. So that was some of the inspiration for this work in the first place. So what have we been able to figure out and determine from the views and tables that we have proposed that help us understand and diagnose some of the reasons for why products might not be successful? So going back to our first view of looking at stakeholders and features, one of the ways that products and services fail in the marketplace is at the outset, we fail to identify all of the important stakeholders. When you miss a stakeholder, you miss the values and the features that may come from them. In this case, if we had just considered the coffee drinker or the user, we might have missed all the features associated with the buyer. And there are a number of case studies, and we'll be talking about one in a little bit, where the fact that they missed an important stakeholder ultimately led to the lack of success of the system. The other important item here is products and systems fail to find success because we don't identify the right features. We either have too many, we have not enough. Often the too many problem leads to product complexity, and if we've missed a stakeholder, we're also not including some of the important features. And not only identifying proper features is important, but identifying the appropriate feature attributes is also an important step here. If we get the right stakeholders and if we get the right features, there's also the challenge of we have to properly identify how the stakeholders value those features. If we get some of these indications wrong, we're perhaps valuing some features too high or too low in the design process, as we go through that phase of the project. And then from our second view, even though we've maybe done the design and completion of a nice product, there may be other options and choices in the marketplace that stakeholders are going to choose over ours. In the coffee example, we saw that, that Starbucks has some characteristics that some stakeholders will find attractive. The traditional drip coffee maker is attractive in some situations, and the Keurig cold is also attractive in some situations. In some class uses of the concepts here, we've found that using some case studies is a very effective way to illustrate some of these concepts. So here we've got 6 examples. We have the Keurig coffee maker, we have the Keurig cold, which was a Keurig-like product to make single-serving soft drinks. We have the Neo-Nurture infant incubator that was designed to be low cost and easily serviced with automotive parts. We have the Exubera inhalable insulin product that was introduced a number of years ago. We have the Play Pump, which was like a merry-go-round with a pump associated with it that as children played, it would pump water for the community to drink. And the last one is a juice maker it's called Juicero, that you would, it was an internet-enabled connected system that they would send you juice packs, and the Juicero system would process the juice and give you single-serving, high-quality juice drinks. So of these 6, only one found success in the marketplace, and that's the Keurig coffee system. All of the others had some issues associated with it. With the infant incubator and the Neo-Nurture, they left out a stakeholder of talking to the manufacturer. They couldn't find a manufacturer who was willing to make it. And the concern being that since it was made from interchangeable auto parts, that we're not certain if the wrong part would be installed at the wrong time, which would ultimately impact the performance of the system and harm the infant that was inside it. On the inhalable insulin, there were some product performance issues, but also some issues of cultural acceptance, that the device was big, bulky, didn't preserve patient privacy, and people couldn't tell if it was a medical device or an illegal drug device. The Play Pump also had some issues of cultural acceptance, of the connection of play with water, and the location of the pump turned out to be an issue for the community. And on the juice maker, also some issues of cost and performance. It was very expensive relative to other options that we all have for drinking fresh juice. So let's take a look at one of these in more detail and see what we can see. So let's look at the Keurig coffee maker versus the Keurig cold. So the Keurig cold was a system that Keurig introduced in 2014. They spent about $250 million in the development. It was on the market about 10 months. They only sold a few thousand systems, and at that time they had stopped the production. So we have some information here that the retail coffee market is about 12 billion. The soft drink market is almost 100 billion. So you could certainly see the interest that the company had in trying to take their name and proven technology and the single drink concept into a new and much larger market. So this is our first view. So for the Keurig cold, we identified the important stakeholders, we identified the important features, and the features look a lot like the ones we had for for a coffee example. We're obviously interested in taste, we're interested in temperature, variety, delivery time, cleaning time, how affordable it is in terms of dollars per serving and dollars per unit. I believe when the Keurig Cold came out that the selling price was initially something like $398. So it was, it came at a high selling price. So looking at our second view, we're now going to compare the Keurig Cold machine versus just a regular can of soft drink that may be in our refrigerator or otherwise available. So we're going to take the single can of soft drink. That's our benchmark. That's going to be D1. It's going to be at 0. In our second view here, second table, we're going to take the features we just identified, bring them over. And now as we compare the Keurig Cold to the single can of soft drink, doesn't seem to line up or compare in a very favorable way. Much less affordable on buying the unit. It's more expensive on a per serving basis. The taste and the temperature were about the same. The delivery time took longer. It took longer to clean up. So in this particular case, the Keurig Cold really doesn't offer very many advantages over an option that's already existing in the marketplace. And another factor that relates to the soft drink situation here is that the buyer and the seller may not be the same person. And the concept might be that the child in the home is the drinker and the parent is the buyer. And there's a certain perception around healthfulness of soft drinks that the buyer of the machine might perceive in a negative way. So if the buyer is expected to pay a much higher price up front and the healthfulness concerns are also present, those are also factors that go against the success of the Keurig Cold. The other nice thing about case studies is you have hindsight in your favor, so it's easier to make some of these assessments and conclusions about why a product has been or has not been successful. So all of the 6 examples that we just looked at, we've used them for examples in classes, and each one has a unique characteristic of an interesting stakeholder, an interesting feature, interesting other choices that are available for consumers in that situation. So these 2 views are very nice to use in a classroom setting for helping students look at case studies and try to understand why products and systems have or have not been successful in the marketplace. Ella?
Okay, so what Bill did was walk us through our 4th key point, designing for value is challenging, represented by the high rate of product failure in the marketplace. The Keurig Cold, I remember when this came on the market, and I thought, wow, that seems like a really expensive device. And then, as Bill said, it only lasted about 10 months. So I think they got a little dose of designing for value in that experience. So let's review our 4 key points here. We contended at the beginning that a value creation mindset centers on considering stakeholders, features, design processes, and selection strategies. And we did this by exploring 4 key points. Our first key point, as you can see, is that value represents a perception based on multiple dimensions expressed in choices. And Bill kind of made the little joke about the 1992 Honda Accord. He actually does drive this vehicle, just that's why it's in there, if you didn't get that particular part. And so thinking about what are the choices that stakeholders are going to be made. Choices there as a key part, a core component, perception as a core component, and multiple dimensions as a core component. All 3 of those pieces feed into key point number 2. Key point number 2 being that the alignment of stakeholder interests and features creates value in products and services. So the alignment of those 3 parts, the perception, the dimensions, and the choices, is where the value is coming from. We know that, as Bill has said, and as I said, you know, a large percentage of new products and services fail in the marketplace. And so clearly there is a lack of alignment. When students are attempting design or are working in a capstone sequence, oftentimes because of the greater experience of faculty teaching those courses, we can immediately see where alignment is not occurring. But you know, so students need help with this particular task. And we think this very simple view of who are the stakeholders, how high is their priority, and what are the actual attributes of the features you intend to design into your product. What is it that you're getting out of those? Our third key point, represented by the Starbucks coffee, is that when a product or system is chosen, stakeholders are valuing it above competing options. In the marketplace today, there is hardly a product or service that could be considered truly unique. Products or services that we see today are extensions, modifications, or intriguing twists on existing products or services. So there will almost always be competing options. That key point number 3 uses the view of scaling designs relative to each other. There's always a baseline. Does the design under consideration exceed the baseline for the attributes of interest, or does it fail to meet the baseline set by the existing products? And finally, key point number 4 is that designing for value is challenging, represented by the high rate of product failure in the marketplace. Bill explored the case studies that he uses to illustrate this. We think that looking at case studies and using the couple of views that we introduced in this webinar allows students to generate a very broad view of stakeholders, including some that are actually atypical. We think that the views, when they're added to the design process there in key point number 4, help promote insightful approaches to considering features and help students consider various trade-offs. I was recently shopping for washing machines, and I'm the type of buyer that basically wants the clothes to come out wet and clean, and that's it. And you actually can't buy that washing machine anymore. And so I'm kind of like hoping that someone will get this idea that more features is not necessarily always the answer, and design a washing machine made just for me. I would really love that. So these 4 key points are trying to capture the overall perspectives that we have on creating a value creation mindset. If you're very experienced in this area, you might be thinking, wow, what they just talked about was so obvious. And I agree with you. Some of these points are actually very obvious. Obvious doesn't mean easy, as we know by the rate of failure in the marketplace. And so if we know that failure exists, why does failure exist? And we think failure exists due to these 4 key points. So that is a whirlwind tour through our perspectives on creating value in the marketplace. We intentionally planned to end with a few minutes to spare so that we could take questions from those of you who are joining us here today. And we hope that you'll throw in some very challenging questions, and that will allow Bill and I to further refine our ideas, but also provide some additional examples. So in closing, I would like to thank you for taking your time out to listen to our webinar today.